How we doing, everybody? What's up? I am Jason C, and welcome to the Mash and Drum Whiskey Room. I hope you guys enjoyed some of the shots that I showed you of the actual whiskey room, some of the shelves I have, some of the stuff that some of my collection that seems to just keep growing and growing. I showed you some of my shelves on the other wall where I have just a ton of bottles. And the collection just seems to keep growing. And the reason why I wanted to show you guys is because before I had all this, of course I had to start somewhere, and at that time I had no idea what to buy. So in this video, I'm trying to build the perfect bourbon collection for beginners for about $400-ish. And as I thought about it, I didn't want to just pick out stuff that I think is somewhat available, affordable, and a great value, but bourbons that can start a conversation about the history of America's native spirit while sipping along and sharing with friends and family, because that's, to me, that's what it's really all about. By the end of this video, not only will you have a solid collection for any new bourbon drinker, but one that you and anyone you share the bourbon with can appreciate. What I've selected are very available for the majority of you out there. There may be one or two that could be hard to find. I know there's one that's in particularly hard to find that you might actually find surprising to be on this list, but hopefully you guys could find about 85 to 95% of these. So get your notebooks out and let's go shopping. All right, guys, so I hope you have those notebooks ready. I'm gonna keep a tab on the side here so I could show exactly the cost of the bottles and exactly what it's gonna add up to as we go through the shopping list to stay in our budget of about $400 or less. So I'm also gonna go through some of the history of each bottle, so when you buy these bottles, you guys can talk about those bottles with your family and friends or whoever you share these bourbons with, because like I mentioned, that's what it's really about. So let's go to our first selection. First one up is Eliza Craig. This is a staple that should be on any shelf. It's sweet, it's smoky, it's spicy, it's balanced, and it's pretty cheap. Now, it carries the name of the so-called father of bourbon. The story goes that Eliza Craig, a Baptist preacher, educator, and entrepreneur, built the first paper and wool mills in Georgetown, Kentucky. He was also a gifted distiller, and in 1789 was the first distiller to age his whiskey in new charred oak barrels. Now, some claim that an accidental fire charred his barrels and changed the whiskey inside. Others say he stored his whiskey in former sugar barrels and was impressed with how charring improved the flavor. That is also why it says 1789 on the bottle, why it's embossed in the bottles, because of that date. Now, some say the story is bogus, but not only is this a great bottle of bourbon that's affordable and available, but talking about the story amongst family and friends while sipping always makes for a fun conversation. This is $28.99 in my area, so let's say 30 bucks. All right, next one on the list is Maker's Mark 46. We need a wheated bourbon on the list, and this is the one I selected because Weller is just too damn hard to find. Now, Maker's in itself is a classic wheated bourbon that often gets overlooked, and nowadays because of the popularity of those big name wheaters like Weller and Pappy Van Winkle. Bill Samuels Sr.'s quest to create Maker's Mark began with his only copy of the family's trusted 170-year-old recipe, the one the sixth-generation distiller promptly set on fire by accidentally burning a set of drapes in the process. So Bill, to save years of aging time, baked several loaves of bread with various grain combinations instead of distilling them. So his quick thinking not only saved time, but also led him to swap out traditional rye grain that is commonly used in bourbons for soft red winter wheat. Now, this gave him the soft and sweet flavor he was looking for without the burn that some people dislike from the rye grain. The shape of the bottle, look at the label, the signature red wax topper, and even the name itself are all thanks to Margie Samuels. The Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Famer and first woman involved with the distillery to be inducted hand-dipped the first wax bottles in her kitchen using a home fryer to melt the wax. Maker's 46 starts off as the standard Maker's, and heavily seared French oak staves are placed in just emptied standard Maker's Mark barrels. They're then refilled and returned to the warehouses to finish for an undisclosed amount of time. It's supposed to be about 2 to 3 additional months. I think it's a big step up from standard Maker's. It's oak, caramel, cinnamon, baked bread, hint of spice, a little bit more chocolatey, I think, too. I think it's also a little bit more velvety on the palate. 750 milliliter bottle will only hit your budget for about 35 bucks. Next up is Wild Turkey 101. Now 101 is probably Wild Turkey's most well-known bourbon and their flagship brand. This is a bourbon I talk about a lot that deserves to be in everyone's collection. It's basically a budget bourbon that has a layered flavor experience, a nice balance of sweet and spicy flavors. It's a great mixing bourbon with that spice and is crafted by Bourbon Royalty, the father-son master distiller combination of Jimmy and Eddie Russell. But before the Russells were involved, in 1891, Thomas Rippey built the Old Hickory Distillery in Tyrone, Kentucky, near Lawrenceburg, on the former site of the Old Moor Distillery. And after Prohibition, the Rippey family repaired the distillery and began to produce bourbon again. It was that same Rippey distilled bourbon that first went into the bottle when Wild Turkey was created by Austin Nichols in the 1940s. Now, they continued to provide most of the whiskey for Austin Nichols before Austin Nichols finally purchased the Rippey distillery in the 1970s. That is when the Russell family entered the picture, as Jimmy Russell was the distiller who made the whiskey at Wild Turkey until he retired and passed the helm on to his son Eddie. Now, the Wild Turkey brand is said to have been created after an Austin Nichols executive named Thomas McCarthy took some warehouse samples on a Wild Turkey hunting trip in 1936. The bourbon was really popular amongst his circle of friends that continued to ask him for that Wild Turkey bourbon. A legendary story for a legendary brand with a legendary price, $22 where I am. Next up is a historic staple, Colonel E.H. Taylor Small Batch. Now, this isn't just about what a solid bourbon this is, it's about what the name on the bottle represents. E.H. Taylor Jr. was a visionary in the whiskey world with a mind for distilling that was years ahead of its time. He founded a world-class distillery, made advancements to the industry, and fought for the purity and legitimacy of bourbon, gaining him the title Father of the Modern Bourbon Industry. Colonel Taylor is celebrated for countless innovations that he contributed to the bourbon industry in his time. He purchased in 1869 a small lease-town distillery that he christened OFC, or Old Fire Copper. It was his first leap into distilling. He made an immediate mark by modernizing, expanding, and upgrading that plant. Among his innovations were copper fermentation tanks, state-of-the-art grain equipment, column stills, modernized buildings, a more efficient sour mash technique, and first-of-its-kind steam heating system still used by barrel warehouses today. But his biggest mark came in 1897 when he was instrumental in fighting for higher standards in the bourbon industry, pushing for the passage of the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897. So with his drive and the help of other prominent figures in whiskey at the time, the Bottled in Bond Act was formed, thus ushering in a new standard for trust and knowing exactly what you're buying in the bottle. Now, his small batch bourbon is probably the easiest to find in the lineup, but it could be still pretty difficult. This is one of those bottles that may be a little bit harder to find. It's bottled in bond, of course, which means it's at least 4 years old, 100 proof, product of one distillation season by one distiller at one distillery, and aged in a federally bonded warehouse under US government supervision. It's a beautiful bottle. It comes in this really nice canister. It's sweet, it's flavorful, it's very Buffalo Tracy, has a lot of vanilla, a lot of cherry. It's a real crowd pleaser, a little hint of spice. It's a really nice bottled in bond bourbon. The MSRP on this is $40, like I said, if you could find it at retail. Okay, so we are at about $127 with 4 really solid bourbons. All right, so we're gonna stay in the Buffalo Trace family with what I believe is still the best value Buffalo Trace has in their lineup. Eagle Rare. Why? Because it's a 10-year-old bourbon for around $35. At a time when bourbons from MGP, Michter's, and Widow Jane are selling for close to or over $100, this bourbon is a great opportunity for you to get something with great age on it without breaking the bank. Tasting a bourbon that's 10 years old, you can really taste the higher level of oak influence, sweetness, the cherry, the brown sugars, with all the new releases from non-distilling producers releasing bourbons that are 8 to 12 years old at $80 to $150. It's nice to know that you could find this around an affordable price, and from Buffalo Trace no less. This is 90 proof, it retails for about $35 where I am, and now we have 5 great bottles, but this is where it gets tricky because I think we need to add some more before we call it a day. Next up, we need something from Jim Beam, and rather than overpay for some 80 proof Basil Hayden crap, you can have a much better bourbon at a great price, Knob Creek. The Knob Creek brand itself will turn 30 years old in 2022. Limited edition, anyone? Just saying, it's probably gonna happen, but the brand name was in use long before Beam revived it in 1992. According to Kathleen D. Benedetto, director and global brand educator at Beam Suntory, the Knob Creek label was first in use in 1898. It was owned at the time by the Penn Maryland Corporation, a division of National Distillers, which Jim Beam purchased in 1987. That's when the Knob Creek brand was resurrected, and Knob Creek was also said to be a creek that actually ran through the property and family farm of the one and only Abraham Lincoln. In September 2016, Knob Creek announced it would be ditching its 9-year age statement because the availability and demand of aged whiskey at the distillery wouldn't allow them to continue with that specific age statement. But good news is, with the bourbon boom still in effect and a lot of bourbon aging in Kentucky, the age statement came back last year. So you're getting a 100 proof bourbon that's almost 10 years old for only 35 bucks. It's nutty, it's bold, it's sweet. It's great for cocktails too. I think it punches way above its price point. And to me, it's still kind of an underrated bottle that usually sits on the shelf. So now we have 6 bottles and still just under 200 bucks total, but there are a few bottles missing to round this list out. Okay, next up we need a true high rye bourbon. None of this like, 12%, 13%, high rye bourbons. That's not high rye. This is right here. This is the Four Roses single barrel. Four Roses is actually a love story. It began when Paul Jones Jr., the founder of Four Roses Bourbon, became smitten by the beauty of a Southern belle. It is said that he sent a proposal to her, and she replied that if her answer was yes, she would wear a corsage of roses on her gown to the upcoming grand ball. Paul waited anxiously for her to arrive on the night of the grand ball, and when she arrived in her beautiful gown, she wore a corsage of 4 red roses. He later named his bourbon Four Roses as a symbol of his devout passion for her, and he transferred it to making his beloved Four Roses bourbon, and a brand was born. In 1884, he moved his thriving business to Louisville, Kentucky, where he opened an office in a section of historic Main Street that we now know as Whiskey Row. 4 years later, he trademarked the name Four Roses, and in 1922, the Paul Jones Company purchased the Frankfurt Distilling Company. In 1943, Seagram purchased the Frankfurt Distilling Company primarily to acquire the name Four Roses, and then right after they bought it, they promptly discontinued the bourbon. Now, the brand was discontinued in the US and was moved to the rapidly growing European and Asian markets, where it quickly became and still is a top-selling bourbon in both Europe and Japan today. Enter the legend Jim Rutledge, who then became master distiller in 1995, who brought the brand back to the States. In February 2002, the Kirin Brewery Company purchased the Four Roses bourbon brand. Fast forward to 2015, Jim Rutledge retired as master distiller, and Brent Elliott, who had worked alongside him for 10 years, became the company's new master distiller. Now, what makes Four Roses unique is the ability to combine 2 mash bills with 5 proprietary yeast strains to create 10 distinct bourbon recipes. Now, the 2 mash bills include a 20% rye bourbon mash bill and a 35% bourbon mash bill. Now, the bottle we are adding to the collection is the Four Roses single barrel, which sports the OBSV recipe. Now, the O stands for Four Roses and pretty much starts every recipe you see. B is the high rye 35% mash bill rather than the 20%. S just means straight bourbon, and the last letter V is a yeast that gives delicate fruit, spicy, and creamy flavors. I think it's a must-have. It's 100 proof. It's a true high rye bourbon that I also think is a bit underappreciated. This one is 45 bucks. That means we are at about $242, 7 bottles in. 3 more I think should do it. We need to get something outside of Kentucky to add to the list, and I think I know exactly where to go. Outside of Kentucky, the bulk of bourbon is being produced at Indiana's MGP distillery. Now, while most of that liquid ends up being sold to other producers, MGP started to keep some behind, bottling it under the George Remus label. This is the George Remus bourbon straight out of MGP in Indiana. George Remus was a legendary bootlegger. He was basically the Michael Jordan of bootlegging. He was a son of Cincinnati. Starting as an apothecary, he soon found a loophole or two in the Volstead Act to craft bourbon for medicinal purposes. But he actually had his own pharmacy delivery trucks hijacked by his own people to then sell underground. Hell of a guy. Knowing a great opportunity when he saw it and a great bourbon when he created it, he began his prohibition empire. And while he respected the Volstead Act, the loopholes he found allowed him to build an empire. If you guys watch Boardwalk Empire on HBO way back when, George Remus was depicted on that show. Pretty spot on from what, supposedly he was like in real life. Now, a lot of new distilleries source from MGP, But MGP, which is now available under the George Remus label, gives everyone an opportunity to try the coveted MGP bourbon for only about 40 bucks. Now, MGP under a lot of different labels can sell for well above 100 and even up to $1,000 if it has some good age on it, which is nuts. But this one is 94 proof, non-chill filter for full flavor. Tastes like vanilla, citrus, a little mint and maple, some black tea on the very end. Has a great finish too. The story itself of George Remus is a great one that you could talk about with family and friends. There's a lot more detail that goes into that story. I highly recommend you guys do your research and exactly find out not only what George Remus did, but how, you know, he ended up in jail, he got his wife killed. A lot went on with that entire story. Again, this is gonna hit our budget for about $40, so I think we're about $282, and I think we have only about 2 more bottles to go. Now, the last 2 bottles will probably hit the budget a bit hard, but are essential in my opinion. First is Woodford Reserve Double Oaked, which not only sports a historic name, but also sports a newer bourbon trend that's happening everywhere right now. That bourbon trend is toasting, or a toasted bourbon. Now, first off, Woodford Reserve can be traced all the way back to the year 1812. Woodford also uses ancient distilling methods brought to Kentucky by settlers starting in the 1770s. The Woodford Reserve Distillery was earlier known as the original Old Oscar Pepper Distillery, named after Oscar Pepper, who took over the business from his father, Eliza Pepper. It was Elijah who began distilling on the land in 1812, and Oscar who built most of the modern-day distillery, which stands there today in Versailles, Kentucky. Now, Oscar Pepper, along with Dr. James Crowe, is also credited with perfecting the sour mash process during his work at the Oscar Pepper Distillery, which just means you're taking some of the old mash that was used up in the last run and transferring some of that mash to the new run for flavor consistency. Kind of the same process you would use when you make sourdough bread. Leopold LeBreau and James Graham became new owners of the distillery in 1878, a few years later after Oscar Pepper passed away in 1865. Now, LeBreau and James ran the business until 1940. New owners Brown and Foreman took over operations, eventually selling the distillery in 1972, and production was halted. Brown and Foreman bought back the distillery in 1993, and the operations were in full swing by the next year. Their product was back on the market in 1996 under the name Woodford Reserve, earning the title of official bourbon of the Kentucky Derby in 1999. Now, Woodford Reserve Double Oaked was released in February 2012, more than 15 years after the release of the standard Woodford Reserve Distiller's Select. Now, what makes this unique is Woodford Double Oak is produced by rebarreling Woodford Reserve's Distiller's Select in a second virgin charred oak barrel for a little under a year. That second barrel used is deeply toasted before lightly charred. Toasted bourbon is a trend we are seeing with Eliza Craig, Michter's, soon to be Wild Turkey, and a lot of craft distillers today. But Woodford Reserve was toasting bourbons before everyone was toasting bourbons. So putting that bourbon in a second barrel that's deeply toasted for almost a year really brings out marshmallow, graham cracker, maple syrup flavors, a lot of vanilla. It's sweet. It's got a little bit of fruit to it as it opens up. It's very mouth coating for something at only 90.4 proof. Now, this is 50 bucks, which will hit the budget hard, but it's available everywhere, has a great name with a great history, and some Kentucky Derby credibility. So this bourbon brings our total spend to about 332 bucks. One more to go. So this bottle celebrates, well, I don't really want to celebrate it, but let's just say it's a throwback to one of the most historical events in whiskey history, which is Prohibition. This is the Old Forester 1920 Prohibition-style bourbon. Now, we talked about the Volstead Act and George Remus earlier, but the Volstead Act of 1920, which initiated Prohibition in the USA, granted permits to 6 distillers in Kentucky to continue to bottle bourbon for medicinal purposes. Now, through one of these permits, Old Forester continued to be produced as medicinal whiskey on Louisville's Whiskey Row. It is the only bourbon continuously sold by the same company that has been available for sale before, during, and after Prohibition. During this time, all whiskeys had to be bottled at 100 proof, and with a barrel entry proof of only 100, the Angel Share would have created a 115 proof whiskey after maturation and evaporation. 1920 pays homage to that style. Now, Old Forester in itself was founded by George Garvin Brown in 1870. Now, Old Forester was the first bourbon sold exclusively in sealed bottles, and as I mentioned, was one of 6 distillers able to sell medicinal bourbon during Prohibition. The other 5 were American Medicinal Spirits, which later became National Distillers, Shanley Distillers, Glenmore Distillery, Frankfurt Distillery, and P.H. Stitzel Distillery. The 1920 is a fantastic bourbon that brings cherry, chocolate, spice, hint of banana, nice spicy finish, some cinnamon graham cracker on the back end of it too. Talking about Prohibition is a lot better than experiencing it, and you can with this bottle right here. Like I said, 115 proof. This will hit our budget for about 60 bucks in the final bottle, which brings us to our total to about or just under 400 bucks, right on budget. All right, I have one more bottle if you have a little extra money that you want to add to the collection. But I really need a drink before I talk about this bottle because you're not going to believe that I'm telling you this. All right. The bonus bottle is Blanton's. That's right, I said it. Now, why Blanton's? Because historically, Blanton's is an important brand that launched bourbon into being viewed as a more premium category. Now, single barrel bourbon started with Blanton's in 1984. Nearing retirement, master distiller Elmer T. Lee was tasked with creating a new bourbon. He recalled the earlier days of his career in the late 1940s when he worked under Colonel Albert B. Blanton's. By the way, Albert B. Blanton, that middle name B, actually stands for bacon. Colonel Albert Bacon Blanton was president of the George T. Stagg Distillery until 1952. Now, Elmer remembered that when Colonel Blanton would entertain dignitaries and other important guests, he would hand-pick honey barrels from the center cut of Warehouse H and have that bourbon bottled 1 barrel at a time. Now, as a tribute to Colonel Blanton, Elmer T. Lee decided to name this new bourbon Blanton's Single Barrel. The idea was very forward-thinking at the time because it challenged the identity of what most folks thought bourbon to be. Today, single barrels are very sought after, but Blanton's was arguably first. Now, today, Blanton's is about a 6-year-old bourbon bottled at 93 proof. Retails for 60 to 65 bucks, but it's very hard to find, and unfortunately, it's often jacked up in price. Now, it comes in that iconic grenade-shaped bottle, wrapped with a label with handwritten details, and we can't forget the horsey top with the small letters that spell out Blanton's if you collect them all. Now, as much as today's popularity and chase for this bourbon really gets to me, you can't argue the history, the mystique, and the effect of this bottle when it's brought out and shared amongst friends and family. It does make an impression. It is an iconic bottle, and if you have the means to find one for retail, I'm not saying to go buy 50 of them, but if you could find 1 or 2 to add to the collection at a great price along the way, after you've spent your budgeted $400, then this would be a great cherry on top to add to your collection. All right, guys, so here it is, 10 bottles with 1 bonus bottle of Blanton's mixed in there. This is my version of the perfect collection for the beginner for about 400 bucks. Let me know down in the comments what you think of the collection. I really think that each of these bottles has a great story to tell, and if you're just getting into bourbon and you're looking to build your collection, you could start off with these 10 bottles and talk about them with some historical context to them, learn a little something, educate, enjoy, sip on with family and friends. You know, I think it's a pretty damn good collection. So let me know what you think in the comments. And if you liked the video, hit the subscribe button below. Also hit that like button. Find me on Instagram, find me on Twitter. Let me know again in the comments what you think. And as I always say, it's not about the whiskey, it's the people you share it with. So cheers, and time to go shopping. Get out of here. Go get them.